She bought an abandoned church for $4,800 just to have a place to live. But when the ground in front of the entrance collapsed, everything changed. What she saw under the foundation turned her life upside down forever. Write in the comments which city you are from. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. The rain had stopped by the time Carolyn parked the truck at the bottom of the hill. The road was narrow, cut through the trees like a scar, still slick with mud. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, the kind that clings to your shoes and makes every step heavy. In the passenger seat, Lily pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging up a small circle. She was 8, quiet for her age, but her eyes missed nothing. When the silhouette of the old church appeared through the mist, she straightened up and whispered, almost in awe, "Is that it, Mom?" Carolyn nodded. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. It looked worse than in the photographs. Gray, sagging, half swallowed by vines. A small wooden cross still leaned against the front gable, its paint flaking like old skin. One of the windows was broken, and the bell tower had lost its top. But even in ruin, something about it drew her in. There was space there, and quiet. A place that asked for patience instead of money. Money was the one thing she no longer had. She turned off the engine, and the world went silent except for the ticking of the cooling metal. Lily climbed out and pulled her jacket tight against the wind. Carolyn stepped onto the gravel and felt the chill cut through her jeans. She stood there for a moment, staring at the building that might, if she was lucky, become their home. It had been 3 months since the divorce was finalized. Her ex-husband had taken the better car, the savings, and whatever faith she had left in stability. The small apartment they rented afterward was too expensive for her part-time job at the accounting office, and she'd spent nights calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up. Every time she thought she saw a way out, another bill arrived. When she finally saw the listing for former church property, $4,800 sold as is, she thought it was a scam. That was less than a used car, less than 3 months of rent. But the listing was real. The property belonged to the county, left unsold for years after being declared structurally unsafe. No one wanted to touch it. Now, standing at the bottom of the hill, she realized why. The stairs to the front door had partly collapsed. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and small trees that had pushed up between the paving stones. The air smelled faintly of mold. Still, she felt something like gratitude, because this ruin, at least, she could afford. She reached for Lily's hand. "Let's take a look." Inside, the air was cold and stale, filled with the scent of wet wood and dust. Their footsteps echoed as they walked through the nave. The pews were gone, but the sunlight slanted through tall arched windows, falling on the cracked floorboards in long golden stripes. The light made everything softer, the chipped paint, the water stains, even the silence. Lily's voice rose softly, almost reverently. "It's like it's waiting for someone." Carolyn smiled faintly. "Maybe it is." She walked slowly toward the altar space, where a small wooden platform still stood. Her footsteps stirred up faint motes of dust that danced in the light. For a brief moment, she could almost imagine what it once was. Voices singing, candles burning, people gathered close. And then, just as quickly, she imagined something else. A table there, a bed in the corner, books stacked by the wall, a home. That night, in a cheap motel on the edge of town, she couldn't sleep. Lily had fallen asleep watching an old cartoon on Carolyn's laptop, but Carolyn lay awake, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The image of the church wouldn't leave her mind. It was broken. Yes, but it was hers if she dared to take it. By morning, she had made the decision. 2 weeks later, she signed the papers at the county office. The clerk looked surprised, even skeptical. You know what you're buying, right? It's not safe. Roof's half gone. You'll need permits just to live there." Carolyn nodded. "I understand." When she handed over the check, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sense that something irreversible had begun. They moved in with little more than what fit into the back of the truck: a mattress, a folding table, a few boxes, and a space heater. On the first night, they ate sandwiches sitting on the floor near the altar, the wind whistling through the broken window above them. The place felt both enormous and intimate, as though the walls were listening. The days that followed were hard. Cold mornings, the smell of damp wood, the echo of every sound. Carolyn patched the roof with tarps, cleared leaves from the floor, and scrubbed away mold with vinegar and soap. She found old tools left behind by whoever had last cared for the building rusted nails, a hammer, a ladder that creaked but held. Lily helped where she could, handing her mother brushes or holding the flashlight when it grew dark. She was fearless in the way only children can be, running through the echoing rooms as if exploring a castle. Sometimes she'd sit by the window with her homework, wrapped in a blanket, and say, "It's not that bad, Mom. It just needs us." Carolyn laughed the first time she said it. But that night, when the wind rose and the rain began again, she found herself whispering the same words. "It just needs us." Weeks passed. Bit by bit, the church began to change. The smell of mold faded. The floor dried. She found curtains at a thrift store and hung them across the windows. They cooked on a small camping stove and washed dishes in a plastic tub. On weekends, she picked up extra hours at the cafe downtown, her hands smelling of coffee and disinfectant when she came home late. Every evening, she and Lily would sit by the small electric heater, drinking tea from mismatched mugs, talking about what they would fix next. "Once we seal the windows," Carolyn said one night, "it'll stay warm." "And after that?" Lily asked. "Maybe paint the walls, or fix the stairs, or—" Carolyn smiled faintly. "Get a real bed." Lily giggled. "But the floor's fine. It feels like camping." The truth was, they were barely getting by. The few $1,000s Carolyn had saved were gone, spent on roof materials, insulation, and repairs. Her paycheck disappeared into groceries and gas. Still, each morning she woke with a sense of quiet determination. The church, once hollow and cold, began to feel like it was breathing again. Sometimes neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, curious about the woman and her child living in the abandoned building. A few stopped to talk. One man, a retired carpenter named Ben, leaned on his truck and said, "That place has been empty for years. You're brave to take it on." Carolyn shrugged. "It was cheap," he chuckled. "Cheap's a funny word. Sometimes it costs the most in the end." But he lent her a few boards anyway. As the weeks turned into months, the sound of her hammering and sanding became part of the town's landscape. People grew used to seeing lights glowing through the arched windows at night. And though Carolyn never said it aloud, she felt something stirring inside her, something close to pride. She had done this. Not perfectly, not easily, but with her own hands. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, she sat by the small window overlooking the hill. The moonlight touched the garden outside, still wild and uneven. She thought of all the things that could still go wrong: the roof collapsing, the money running out, the town forcing them out. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The silence of the church no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space for something new to grow. She turned off the lamp and listened to the faint sound of crickets outside. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped down the hill from the last rain. The earth was restless but alive, like the building itself. Carolyn closed her eyes and whispered to the dark, "We'll make this work." And though there was no one there to answer, She could almost believe that the walls agreed. The days ahead would test that belief in ways she couldn't yet imagine, but for now, in the quiet heart of the old church, it was enough. The roof held, the child slept, and outside, the hills waited for the next rain. By early spring, the hills turned green again. The cold that had lingered for months softened, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The church, which had once seemed hollow and abandoned, now looked almost lived in. There were curtains in the windows, a small wooden chair by the door, and flower pots that Lily had painted with bright, uneven streaks of color. From the road below, it looked less like a ruin, and more like a home that was still learning how to breathe again. Carolyn spent her mornings checking the roof and sealing cracks in the walls. Her hands had become rough from work, her nails chipped, her back sore most evenings. But she didn't complain. Each repair felt like a small victory, one more reason to believe that she and Lily had made the right choice. When she went into town to buy groceries or supplies, people had stopped looking at her like a curiosity. Some even smiled or asked how the old chapel was coming along. Life was hard but stable, which for Carolyn was enough. She still took extra shifts at the cafe, wiping counters until midnight, counting every tip before locking up. She didn't have savings, not really, but she had something else now, a place that was hers, a roof that she could patch herself, walls that kept the rain mostly out, and a daughter who laughed again. The first real storm of the season came on a Thursday. It started as a drizzle in the afternoon and grew into a downpour by nightfall. The wind pushed against the windows, and the sound of water drumming on the roof filled every corner of the church. Carolyn lay awake, listening to it, measuring every creak, every sigh of wood. She had reinforced most of the beams, but the sound still frightened her. She imagined the weight of the water pressing down, the ground softening beneath the old foundation. When she stepped outside the next morning, the air was heavy with mist. The rain had carved shallow rivulets down the hill, and the soil was slick under her boots. She walked around the church, inspecting for damage, until she reached the front steps and froze. The ground had collapsed. Where yesterday there had been grass and gravel, there was now a gaping hole, a dark wound in the earth. The soil had sunk nearly 2 meters deep, leaving a jagged edge that stretched almost to the front porch. She crouched, peering into the darkness, but could see only wet clay and broken roots. The earth smelled raw, almost metallic. Panic came fast. If the ground had given way here, what if it did the same beneath the building? What if the church itself wasn't safe anymore? She called the county office first. They transferred her 3 times before a voice told her someone could come by sometime next week. Then she called a local contractor who said he'd take a look for $200 just to inspect the site. $200 might as well have been $2,000. By noon, she sat on the porch steps with her head in her hands. The hole gaped at her like a question she didn't have the answer to. Lily came outside, still in her pajamas, clutching a piece of toast. "What happened, Mom?" "Just the rain," Carolyn said, forcing calm into her voice. "It's fine. Don't get too close." Lily nodded but kept staring, her eyes wide. "Looks like the ground fell asleep." That night, the wind picked up again, and Carolyn barely slept. Every sound from outside made her flinch. She imagined the foundation cracking, the church tilting, the floor splitting open. By morning, she decided she couldn't wait for the county. She called the same contractor again and agreed to the inspection. He arrived that afternoon, a man in his 60s with a measuring tape and mud-stained boots. He circled the hole, took photos, and crouched to touch the soil. "You've got an old drainage system running under this hill," he said finally. "Built back in the 30s, maybe earlier. There's probably a concrete pipe down there, and it's collapsed. The ground above it's been slowly sinking for years. The rain just sped it up." "Can it be fixed?" Carolyn asked. Anything can be fixed, he said, straightening up. But it's not cheap. You'd need to fill it, reinforce the slope, maybe even reroute the water. 10, 15,000? Easy. She stared at him. I don't have that kind of money. He gave a small shrug, not unkindly. Then I'd think about cutting your losses, ma'am. Sell what you can, move before it gets worse. That building's sitting on borrowed time. After he left, Carolyn sat for a long time on the porch, staring at the hole. The late afternoon light turned the mud red, and the sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep inside the earth. It was like the hill itself was sighing. For the first time since buying the church, she let herself cry. Quietly, so Lily wouldn't hear. 2 days later, she drove to the municipal office with a folder of papers. The clerk who had handled her purchase recognized her immediately. Ah, the old chapel, he said. How's it holding up? Not well, she replied. There's a sinkhole. I need to know if the property can be returned to the county. He frowned, flipping through the pages. You want to relinquish it? I can't afford the repairs. If I stay, it might collapse. He tapped a form on the desk. You can file this. It'll take about 30 days to process. But once you sign, the property's no longer yours. She looked at the paper, at the space for her signature. Her hands trembled slightly. She thanked him, took the form, and walked outside without signing it. That evening, she sat on the steps again, holding the form. The air was warm and still. The hole lay a few feet away, its edges already drying into cracked clay. She thought of everything they had done. The cleaning, the repairs, the nights spent on the floor by the heater. It couldn't all end like this. She heard the door creak behind her. Lily padded out barefoot and sat beside her. You're sad, she said. Just tired. Because of the hole? Because of a lot of things. Lily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. We can fix it. You fix everything. Carolyn laughed softly, but it caught in her throat. Not this time. Lily didn't argue. She just stayed there, quiet, small, and warm against her side. The sky above them shifted from blue to purple, then to black. Somewhere in that stillness, Carolyn felt something change. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was close, a refusal to give up. The next morning, she made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a letter. It wasn't to the county or a contractor, but to the editor of the local paper. She told the truth about the purchase, the repairs, the sinkhole, and how she was running out of options. She didn't ask for charity. She just wanted people to understand what this place meant to her and her daughter. A week later, the story ran with a photo of the church and the headline, Mother and Daughter Try to Save the Old Hilltop Chapel. At first, Carolyn was embarrassed. She didn't like attention. But that evening, when she came home from work, a cardboard box sat on the porch. Inside were 2 bags of cement and a note. For patching holes, good luck. The next day, a man she didn't know stopped by in an old pickup truck. Saw your story, he said. Used to do some masonry work. Mind if I take a look? Within days, more people came. A retired engineer brought rebar. 2 high school boys offered to shovel dirt. An elderly woman from down the hill brought sandwiches. What started as curiosity turned into something else, a kind of quiet alliance. Each weekend, a small group gathered at the church. They worked, they talked, they shared coffee in the mornings and soup in the afternoons. No one said the word miracle, but that's what it felt like in slow motion. Strangers building something together without being asked. Carolyn found herself learning to accept help. She handed out tools, learned how to mix cement, laughed when the boys smeared mud on each other's shirts. It wasn't just about saving the building anymore. It was about belonging to something that didn't ask for perfection. The repairs took weeks. The ground was filled layer by layer, reinforced with gravel and concrete, sealed against future rain. When it was done, the slope looked solid again, and the fear that had lived in Carolyn's stomach for months began to ease. One evening, after everyone had gone home, she stood with Lily at the edge of the yard, staring at the place where the sinkhole had been. The soil was smooth now, newly planted with grass seed. The air was warm and smelled of earth. "We should put something here," Lily said, "so it doesn't just look like dirt." "Like what?" "Flowers, or a bench, a place to sit." Carolyn thought about it for a long moment. "A garden, maybe. Something that reminds us what came from it." A week later, they began planting. Lavender, marigolds, a few wildflowers that Lily picked herself. Carolyn built a small wooden bench from leftover planks. By midsummer, the flowers had taken root, and the smell of lavender drifted through the open windows of the church. Sometimes, people from town still came by, just to see how things were going. The retired engineer brought his wife one Sunday and said, "Didn't think that place would ever stand again." Carolyn smiled. "Neither did I." They talked a while about the weather, about how the hill had stopped shifting. When they left, he said something that stayed with her. "You gave this town back a piece of itself." That night, as she sat on the bench with Lily, watching the sun dip behind the hills, Carolyn felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The church wasn't perfect. The paint still peeled, and the walls still creaked, but it was alive. It was theirs. She looked at her daughter, whose hair shone gold in the fading light, and thought about everything the hole had taken from them. The fear, the uncertainty, but also what it had given back. People. Connection. The quiet understanding that sometimes a collapse isn't an ending, but a beginning waiting to be built. When the first stars appeared, Lily reached for her hand. "It's pretty here," she said, "even with all the work." Carolyn squeezed her fingers gently, "especially with all the work." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of lavender and damp soil. Somewhere down the hill, a car door closed, and the sound of laughter drifted faintly through the evening air. For once, the silence around the church didn't feel empty. It felt like it was full of life, like the earth had taken a deep breath and settled again. Carolyn leaned back against the bench and let her eyes close. For the first time since the storm, she wasn't afraid of what lay beneath her feet. She trusted it now, the same way she trusted the cracked beams above her and the stubborn walls that had refused to fall. It wasn't just the land that had been restored. It was something deeper, something she hadn't realized was missing until it returned. A sense of belonging to a place, to a purpose, to the simple rhythm of ordinary days. And as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the hills, she whispered to herself, "We're going to be all right." She didn't need anyone to answer. The silence did that for her. By late summer, the hills around the church shimmered in heat. The air smelled of warm grass and dust, and the days stretched long and golden. The garden that had once been nothing more than a filled-in scar of earth now bloomed with color. Lavender swayed in the wind beside yellow marigolds and soft blue asters, and the small wooden bench that Carolyn had built was shaded by a young maple tree that one of the townspeople had planted in spring. From the road, the old church no longer looked abandoned. Its windows caught the sunlight, its door stood open during the day, and laughter sometimes drifted out from within. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like the building belonged to the living again. Carolyn's mornings began early. She would stand by the kitchen counter, once part of the old vestry, and make coffee while Lily still slept. The light came in through the window, glancing off the freshly painted walls. She had managed to patch the plaster and cover the cracks, and now the room smelled faintly of pine from the floor polish she used. There was still so much left to fix, but now it no longer felt like an endless battle. It felt like care, the ordinary kind that keeps a place breathing. She'd learned that nothing ever truly gets finished. Homes, like people, just keep growing into themselves. In the months after the sinkhole was filled, life had settled into a rhythm that was both simple and full. Carolyn worked 3 days a week teaching basic accounting classes at the library downtown. It didn't pay much, but it gave her something steadier than cafe shifts, and it let her feel useful in a way that money couldn't measure. She taught people how to balance checkbooks, how to understand taxes, how to rebuild credit after layoffs or divorces. Most of her students were women, not so different from her. Tired, practical, trying to find their footing. Sometimes she'd catch herself smiling when she explained how she'd saved the church, dollar by dollar, and they'd nod as though what she'd done wasn't crazy, but brave. Lily had found her own rhythm, too. She attended the small elementary school in town and had made friends, real ones this time. Every afternoon she would run down the path, her backpack bouncing, her voice bright as she told her mother about her day. Her drawings covered the refrigerator, pictures of the church with flowers in the yard, of herself and Carolyn sitting on the bench, of the cat from the neighbor's barn that had taken to visiting them. The child who once whispered through empty rooms now filled them with sound. Carolyn realized one evening, as she washed the dishes and listened to her daughter humming in the next room, that the silence she had once needed so badly had turned into something else. She didn't crave quiet anymore. She craved moments like this, small, ordinary, full of life. On weekends, the church had begun to take on a new purpose. What started as a few neighbors dropping by for coffee had slowly become something larger. People brought folding chairs and pastries, set up tables in the old nave, and shared what they grew in their gardens or baked in their kitchens. Sometimes someone would bring a guitar, and a few songs would fill the air. There were no sermons, no rituals, just a gathering. The building that once held prayers now held conversation, and somehow it felt just as sacred. One afternoon, Ben, the retired carpenter who had helped her with the roof, stopped by carrying a small wooden sign. "Thought you might want this," he said, setting it down by the door. The sign read, "Hilltop Hall. Open Saturdays." Carolyn laughed when she saw it. "It's not really a hall," she said. He shrugged. "It's more of one than it's been in 20 years. He wasn't wrong. People had started calling it that naturally, and though she'd never asked for it, the name stuck. It felt fitting, humble, open, alive. As the months passed, the little community grew. A young couple from town held their wedding reception there, using strings of white lights and wildflowers in jars. A group of teenagers painted the old fence that bordered the property. During a cold snap in early autumn, a few families gathered inside the church to keep warm when the power went out elsewhere. Carolyn brewed coffee on a small propane stove and passed out blankets. In the flicker of candlelight, the church glowed like a memory brought back to life. At night, when everyone was gone and the building was quiet again, Carolyn would sit by the window and look at the garden. The lavender had faded by then, its scent faint but lingering, and the bench gleamed faintly with dew. She'd think about everything that had happened since that first day she saw the listing online, the fear, the exhaustion, the slow, steady work that had carried them here. It amazed her how something that began as desperation had turned into belonging. The building had needed her, yes, but in a way she hadn't understood at first. She had needed it too. Sometimes she wondered what the previous owners would think if they could see it now. Maybe they'd be surprised that a single mother and her daughter had brought it back from ruin. Maybe they'd simply smile and say it was what the place had always been meant for, to shelter whoever needed it most. One crisp morning in October, Carolyn walked outside with a cup of coffee and sat on the bench in the garden. The air smelled of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The sun was low, casting the hill in soft amber light. She could hear Lily laughing inside, getting ready for school. It struck her then how far they'd come from that first winter, when every night felt like a battle against the cold. Now the warmth didn't come from the space heater, it came from the life that had taken root around them. She thought of the people who had helped, the boys with shovels, the woman with sandwiches, the man who brought gravel. None of them owed her anything, yet they came. And through them, she had rediscovered something she had lost long before she ever bought the church. The quiet strength that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. Later that week, she hosted her first workshop inside the church. The library had closed temporarily for renovation, and she offered to hold her evening classes there instead. 5 people showed up the first night, sitting in mismatched chairs around a folding table. The sound of pencils scratching, the smell of fresh coffee, the faint hum of the wind through the eaves. It all felt ordinary and miraculous at once. When the class ended, one of the women lingered. "You know," she said softly, "it's good to have this place again. It makes people talk to each other." Carolyn smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." The season turned, and with it came change. The leaves on the trees surrounding the church burned gold and red, and the hills shimmered with color. Some afternoons, when the air was still, she could hear the sound of laughter from the children playing down the road. It reminded her of the first time she'd stepped into the church and imagined what it might become. Only now, it wasn't imagination. It was real. The building breathed again. It held warmth and stories and footsteps. It had found its rhythm, just as she had. One evening, after dinner, Lily came to sit beside her by the fire. The flames painted their faces in soft light. "Mom," she asked, "why did you buy the church? You could have picked any house." Carolyn smiled, setting aside the mug she was holding. "Because it was the only one we could afford." Lily frowned thoughtfully. "But now it's the prettiest one." "It is," Carolyn said, touching her daughter's hair. "Because we made it that way." They sat in silence after that, listening to the wood crackle, the air outside calm and cool. It was a simple conversation, but it stayed with Carolyn. It reminded her that beauty was rarely something found. It was something built, piece by piece, by hands that refused to stop trying. As winter approached, Carolyn prepared the church for the cold. She sealed the windows with plastic, stacked firewood near the back door, and checked the roof after every storm. The townspeople still visited, though less often. Life had quieted again, but not in a lonely way. The kind of stillness that now filled the church was peaceful, full of memory. Sometimes she'd walk through the rooms at night, touching the walls lightly as she passed, feeling their solidity. Each crack and patch was a reminder of what she had learned, that repair is not just about fixing what's broken. It's about understanding why it's worth saving. When the first snow came, it fell softly, covering the garden in a white blanket. The bench disappeared beneath it, but Carolyn knew it was there, waiting for spring. She stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down, and thought of how everything, earth, wood, stone, even people needed time to rest before they could grow again. She felt no fear for the future anymore. The house that had once been a ruin had become her anchor. It would hold through the storms because it had already survived worse. In February, a letter arrived from the county office. It wasn't a bill or a notice, just a short note informing her that the property had officially been removed from the list of condemned sites. It was, in the clerk's words, deemed structurally sound and suitable for permanent residence. Carolyn read it twice, her hands shaking slightly, then pinned it to the wall beside the calendar. When Lily came home from school, she lifted her up and spun her around, laughing. "We did it," she said. "We really did." The girl smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing the joy behind the words. That night, Carolyn built a fire and sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The snow had stopped, and moonlight spread across the hill. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, where she used to sit as a child, dreaming of a future she could build with her own hands. Somehow, across the years, she had found her way back to that dream. It hadn't looked like she imagined. It had been smaller, messier, more human, but it was real. The next morning dawned clear. The air was sharp and clean, and the world outside shimmered under ice. She opened the door and stepped out barefoot, the cold biting her feet. The church behind her glowed faintly in the early light, every flaw softened by the snow. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the quiet. The hill, the garden, the sky. All of it felt like an extension of the same truth, that sometimes the things we rebuild end up rebuilding us in return. Years from now, people might forget the sinkhole or the article in the paper. They might just remember the lavender, the light in the windows, the laughter that carried down the hill. But for Carolyn, it would always be the same story, the one of a woman who couldn't afford a home and found one anyway, who bought a ruin and made it whole again, not with money, but with patience and love. When the sun finally rose above the ridge, she turned back toward the door, where Lily was standing, sleepy-eyed and smiling. Carolyn reached out her hand. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go inside." And as they stepped back into the warmth of their home, the light spilled after them, filling the church with the quiet glow of morning, of peace, of everything they had built together and everything still waiting to come. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.